Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you for having me here. It's really a great pleasure. Since Kristallnacht, the anti-Jewish pogrom that took place in Germany in November 1938, Richard Wagner became persona non grata in Israel's concert halls. Several days after the pogrom, a work by Wagner was removed from the concert program of the Palestine Symphony Orchestra, later to become the Israel Philharmonic, for ideological reasons. In Israel, Wagner's vicious anti-Semitism and his identification with the racist views of National Socialism made his musical oeuvre into one of the explicit symbols of the Holocaust and its atrocities. However, no state institution, from the legislative to the censorship board and the broadcasting and orchestra institutions, ever publicly banned the performance of Wagner's work. Since the 1990s, Wagner has been the only composer whose performance in Israel has stirred up bitter resentment. The ban on other composers and performers who collaborated with the Nazis was lifted. The gradual lifting of the ban gave birth to the most profound statement against playing the music of these artists. In January 1994, after several sessions of the Knesset debating the performance of works by anti-Semitic composers identified with National Socialism, its Education and Culture Committee came up with a status quo document. Its statement that freedom of expression is a supreme value in Israel was accompanied by an appeal, quote, from the heart, unquote, requesting the cultural institutions to refrain from performing the works of anti-Semitic composers should these hurt the feelings of the public. The public in question was specific: Holocaust survivors who identified the music of the anti-Semitic composers with their lives in the concentration camps. This was the first time the Knesset had ever formulated such a clear-cut request instruction. Until then, the ministers of education and culture were guided by a uniform approach regardless of their political affinity. All believed that there was no room for the state to intervene in a matter that was essentially artistic. Since the year 2000, Israeli courts were requested to issue restrictions on public performances of Wagner. Nevertheless, they responded according to the existing norms by refraining from ruling and calling for social powers to dictate Wagner's level of acceptance in Israel. In this talk, I will analyze the Wagner case as a paradigm for the tension between democratic liberal perceptions and the obligation to respect Holocaust survivors. Thus, I will argue that Wagner became a tool in the design of political and social norms in the young Israeli society, as well as means of consolidating the memory of the Holocaust. Consequently, in Israel, Wagner's music became a memorial site for the Holocaust of European Jewry, and banning him was perceived as a cultural act with an educational angle. Like other important European artists since the 19th century, Wagner's musical works were incorporated into the Palestine Symphony Orchestra's repertoire. The orchestra was established in 1936 by violinist Bronislaw Huberman based on ideological reasons. As a political personality, Huberman was aware of the negative changes affecting German Jews since the Nazis' rise to power. After the Nazi race laws came into effect in February 1936, he published an open and critical letter to German intellectuals in the Manchester Guardian. The extensive repertoire of the orchestra was ideologically challenged following Kristallnacht. It may well be that the total silence of German intellectuals prompted Huberman to respond immediately by removing Die Meistersinging von Nuremberg from the program. The conductor of the concert, Eugen Schenker, could easily relate to the sentiments as he was on the list of the 108 artists who had been banned by the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Thus, the same people who had faithfully supported social liberalism and ideational pluralism in Europe and who had refused to cooperate with the standard bearers of totalitarian perceptions, and here I count also Arturo Toscanini, who was the founding conductor of the orchestra, those people were now those who employed the item of culture in order to express ideological statements. Nonetheless, they could not have foreseen that this momentary act would be perpetuated as voluntary censorship, which would repeat itself time and again. November 1952 was the first time the papers published reports on the intention to play the music by Richard Wagner and Richard Strauss. In fact, the Israel Philharmonic intended to play a piece by Strauss. The immense interest aroused was a counter-reaction to the warming of Israel's foreign relations with West Germany following the signing of the reparation agreement, which caused a heated demonstration. By now, many opposed the idea of playing the music of Strauss, the first head of the music chamber under the propaganda ministry. Nevertheless, the most intolerant reactions were directed at Wagner, who was characterized in Davar Daily as, I quote, the father of anti-Semitic ideology in music and in art in general, unquote. During the 1950s, the subject of the banned composers came up twice more, both with relation to Strauss. In the latter case, at the end of 1956, the subject was raised for debate in the Knesset. Minister of Education Zalman Aran refused to enforce censorship on music, arguing that, quote, once sounds are born, they have an independent existence, unquote. A full-blown storm broke out in June 1966 with the publication of a program article in which the Israel Philharmonic declared its intention of incorporating some of Wagner's and Strauss's pieces in the following season. The article expressed for the first time a rational argument regarding the banned composers, and yesterday we've heard just one sentence from this article, which I'll elaborate on now, and I'll quote it. We feel the time has come for a change, not only because of the paramount demands of artistic freedom, but also because the opposition to Wagner has become a mere gesture. Why should we go on denying ourselves some of the greatest music by forbidding the playing of Wagner, a loss that cannot be replaced by the works of any other composer, while a mere convenience like the German Volkswagen, with all its associations with the Hitler era, is allowed to crowd our streets, unquote. The timing of the announcement was not coincidental. The 1960 initial meeting between Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer in New York led to the establishment of full diplomatic relations in 1965. The 1961 Eichmann trial exposed Israelis to daily life in the camps. Until then, public discussion of the Holocaust was usually limited to dealing with the courage of the few who rose up against the Nazis, courage compatible with the Zionist ethos. Despite the intentions, only at the end of 1981, the Israel Philharmonic played a piece by Wagner for the first time in 43 years. As ever, the public response was emotional and related to political events. The Likud, a party traditionally opposed to ties with Germany, as well as to public performances of works by composers identified with National Socialism, had come into power. When the controversy resumed, Prime Minister Menachem Begin was involved in an open conflict with Chancellor Helmut Schmidt regarding the latter's statement that Germany was indirectly responsible for the Palestinian refugees. In addition, despite their advanced years, Holocaust survivors joined the discussion with a vengeance. It may well be that the relative openness of Israeli society regarding the survivors spurred them to do so, or perhaps they were investing special efforts under the assumption that it was one of their last opportunities to leave their mark on the debate. One of the statements made by Avraham Melamed, a Holocaust survivor and a violinist in the orchestra, is worthy of note, and I quote him. Some time ago, I saw a film, Apocalypse Now, and in one of the scenes, helicopters came down and bombed to the sound of music that made my stomach turn over. At first, I didn't understand what was wrong with me, but afterwards, I suddenly realized that it was Wagner's music, unquote. Melamed's statement clarifies why it was impossible to impose censorship at this stage. In previous decades, Israeli society could conduct internal debates on the issue of composers, as it was a closed society with meager resources. Israelis hardly ever traveled abroad, cultural import to Israel was insignificant, and exposure to international media was limited. Ever since the 1967 war, and particularly since the beginning of the 1980s, the economic situation of the country and its citizens improved. Thus, it was no longer possible to control the cultural abundance experienced by Israelis. The fundamental debate over the freedom of expression with regard to the honor of Holocaust survivors was the main issue. Questions relating to national identity were raised as well, including attacks directed at Zubin Mehta belonging to a different ethnicity. The issue of Wagner and Strauss was raised again several times in the 1980s. In one case, conductor Igor Markevich was allowed to record Till Eulenspiegel with the Israel Broadcasting Authority Symphony Orchestra, but not to perform it publicly. This event spurred the Broadcasting Authority's management to decide to permit playing musical pieces by collaborators with National Socialism, with the exception of Wagner and Strauss, who would be played for didactic purposes only. In October 1989, the Israel Philharmonic played 2 pieces by Wagner during a rehearsal. Even this led to a parliamentary question. With the dawn of the 1990s, for the first time, a short piece by Strauss was incorporated in a concert given by the Rishon LeZion Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Israeli Noam Sherif. 3 years later, the Israel Philharmonic incorporated Strauss in the repertoire, and his music was aired rather intensively on Channel 8, the Culture and Science channel, which was part of the basic channel package in Israel, as well as the Voice of Music, the national classical music program. By the end of the decade, other composers who until then were part of the group of the collaborators boycotted in Israel were also included in the repertoire of Israeli orchestras. Wagner remained controversial, despite the fact that on public broadcasting channels his music was now played freely. Seemingly, it may be said that Israelis had accepted the idea that, problematic as it may be, Wagner was part of the history of music that should be studied. Those who could not bear to hear his music due to their emotions could choose not to listen to a specific program. The following attempt to play Wagner's music in public ignited yet another storm. In 1991, the Israel Philharmonic chose Daniel Barenboim as the conductor of a special Wagner concert. By this way, the Israel Philharmonic intended to avoid 2 obstacles. Barenboim is Jewish and spent his youth in Israel, thus he will be accepted better than Mehta, and the special concert will not provoke subscribers' complaints, being a captive audience. Yet Barenboim, born in 1942, was tagged as an outsider to the experience of Holocaust survivors, just as Mehta had been ruled out belonging to another ethnicity. In this occasion, Holocaust survivors took an even greater and more significant place in the debate. Daily life added powerful emotions. The special concert took place in December 1991, 10 months after the end of the Gulf War, during which Iraq launched missiles at Israel. The threat of chemical warheads, the knowledge that a German company had supplied Iraq with toxic chemicals, dictatorship in Iraq, the religious racist incitement against Israel and Zionism, and their seclusion in their homes, somewhat reminiscent of the ghetto experience, all these revived historical experiences. The comparison between the present and the Holocaust, between Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler, and between the contemporary Iraq and 12 years of Nazi regime were not late in coming. The fact that this time it related to a united and larger Germany only added fuel to the flames. The fact that National Socialism was experienced so vividly in Israeli society almost 50 years after it had collapsed can illuminate why Wagner remained an emblem in Israeli society. In the spring and summer of 2001, matters reached another climax. The affair began with an invitation of the Berlin Staatskapelle and its conductor, Daniel Barenboim, to the Israel Festival. Reports on the orchestra's intention to incorporate a piece by Wagner were raised for debate in the Knesset plenum in April, and in May, the Education and Culture Committee convened for a special debate on the matter. In conclusion, the festival organizers were asked to revoke the program that included the piece by Wagner and replace it with a different one, a request to which they agreed together with Barenboim. However, at the end of the revised concert, the finale of the entire festival, Barenboim asked to discuss the Wagner issue with the audience and play a piece. The restraint in the hall enabled the orchestra to play Liebestod. But it was the quiet before a great storm, which evolved several days later and ended with Barenboim's condemnation by the Knesset Education and Culture Committee as, quote, a culturally persona non grata, unquote. About 6 months earlier, the Rishon LeZion Symphony Orchestra, which was the first to perform Strauss publicly, performed Wagner's Siegfried Idyll. Earlier that year, the Tel Aviv District Court had rejected a petition submitted by 2 Holocaust survivors, both from Rishon LeZion, who requested a permanent injunction instructing the orchestra to refrain from performing any musical pieces by Wagner and Strauss. This was the first time the Wagner affair reached an Israeli court, but the stance of the institutions in Israel remained unchanged. Like the education ministers in the past, the court adopted the pluralistic liberal position. A decade later, the subject re-emerged with the invitation and appearance of the Israel Chamber Orchestra in the Bayreuth annual festival in 2011. For the first time, an Israeli orchestra played Israel's national anthem, Hatikva, in Wagner's town. Notwithstanding, after an initial expression of public anger, the response turned into almost indifference. In contrast, the attempt to play Wagner's music in a one-day public conference generated much annoyance. The Israeli Wagner Society, in cooperation with Israeli conductor Asher Fish, hired some 100 musicians for the Herzl Toscanini Wagner conference scheduled for spring 2012. The venue was to be Tel Aviv University's smallish auditorium, but as soon as the university's officials discovered that the program included performance of Wagner's excerpts, they canceled the rental contract. When the organizers approached the Tel Aviv Hilton Hotel as an alternative venue, they were refused. Once again, social forces and institutional undercurrents in Israel limited the ability to play Wagner's music in public. All these cases are telling. On the institutional level, it was obvious that the state institutions in Israel preferred to leave the Wagner issue open for ad hoc decisions. This was based on a pluralistic standpoint which respects the wishes of individuals in society to listen to Wagner in public or to refrain from doing so. On the social level, a significant change is evident. The ever-increasing intervention of survivors and similar response from the younger generations, which, for instance, left the concert conducted by Barenboim in 2001. Therefore, it seems that opposition to Wagner had become a symbol. Thus, the aspiration to preserve democratic liberal values and cultural pluralism was challenged by the deep desire to totally avoid publicly performing Wagner, which resembles voluntary censorship. The case of Wagner in Israeli society exemplifies the ability of a society to cope with powerful controversy and choose non-solution as a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for some questions, if there are any. I have a question. Can you explain what the difference is between a radio broadcast and a a live performance, since both take place in the public sphere?
Well, I believe that the live performance is the issue. Although I must say that in a live performance we have usually limited audience, while the radio broadcasts for everyone. So I'm not sure why the live performance is the one that draws most of the fire. I would say that the state radio should be the target, right, and not the concert hall. Secondly, I think that the whole issue began because it was the Israel Philharmonic. I mean, the main orchestra in Israel was the one who tried to play Wagner and Strauss and later to break the ban. And I think that this also drew a lot of attention. And as I showed, Rishon LeZion and the Israel Chamber Orchestra, smaller orchestras. Rishon LeZion Orchestra is the orchestra that now plays with the Israeli opera, so it's not that small anymore, but it used to be. So I think that as long as it comes from, let's say, a detour, it's easier to make it happen.
Anna first, and you.
Thank you very much. I have actually two questions, and one is relating to Nicholas. Is there any records or statements what you are aware of the actual Holocaust survivors where they explain it in more detail, except we know it's very emotional or it's about the live performance, where they really say or have arguments why they don't want it?
Well, the general expression is that we've heard Wagner's music in concentration camps, and this was researched thoroughly also by the survivors themselves, musicologists, survivors. And they came to the conclusion that Wagner was never played live in the concentration camps, but it may be, of course, that those officers in the concentration camps used to listen to Wagner in their homes. So probably they heard Wagner. And in any event, Wagner was extremely popular during the Weimar Republic, so he was probably as or almost as popular during the Third Reich. So I believe the Wagner sound was around. So I believe that this is the main point.
And the other question is just about Richard Strauss, which also came into at some point, which we don't hear so much about it at all, but can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, at the beginning, since the 50s, Wagner and Strauss were kind of a couple. They were band together. But as I said, since the 90s, it all had changed. And not for rational reasons, because we know that Strauss actually collaborated. Later on, it was published in Israel that his daughter-in-law was Jewish, hence his grandchildren were Jewish, and in any case, he cooperated with the Nazis only for a short time, so he was kind of excused. And I guess that the main difference in the eyes of Israel is the fact that he never wrote Judentum in Musik, which is, he wasn't a true anti-Semite as Wagner was, and more so his family was.
I have a point of information, if I may. When the Knesset considered the issue of anti-Semitic composers, aside from Wagner and Strauss, were any other names on the table? Particularly non-German anti-Semites?
No, of course. It had to do with, I think that mostly, during the years, I don't remember this specific one. I can go back to it and read it. But usually there was a bunch of forbidden composers, including Franz Lehár, Karl Orff, and this is for obvious reasons, although Orff was performed in the Israeli opera already, I think, in 1965, with no reaction to this. I'm not sure about the 1994 discussion, whether names were mentioned. but it was clear to everyone that this is the group we are talking about.
So the issue would have been not that a composer has anti-Semitic views, but the fact that that Wagner published them and lent them his prestige. And
yeah.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for a fascinating presentation. What about the East-West Divan Orchestra? Did the same principles apply to their repertory? Or were they too recent for the?
Yes. First of all, they're recent, and I'm not sure that they play that much music of this kind, the East-West Divan. So I'm not sure it will apply to them.
We would have time for one more question if... Oh, okay, Ilan.
Thank you so much for that incredibly interesting talk. I just wanted to say something in response to your question earlier. My film, which will be screened later tonight, does include interviews with a number of people in Israel, both supporters and opponents of performing Wagner. So if you stick around later, you might hear some of this again. But that said, in response to your question, whether any of the Holocaust survivors have offered a rationale, at least one survivor who's been prominent in trying to stop Wagner being performed, Uri Chanoch, who was interviewed in my film, he did offer the rationale that it was Wagner's ideological publications, in particular Judentum Musik, as opposed to the music being played in camps, which he said he had no memory of personally and was not even sure whether it happened. But for him, that was not the driver. I also wanted to ask you, Naama, if you had uncovered any research about whether Wagner's music was played, whether live or recorded, in Dachau in the 1930s.
As far as I know, the answer is no. And I rely on a Holocaust survivor musicologist, Moshe Hoch, who had all the reasons to find a positive answer to your question, but finally he came to the conclusion that the answer is no, that no Wagner was played live in any concentration camp or any camp at all. And if I can elaborate about the survivors, since you mentioned it, and we saw it yesterday in one of the excerpts that Olaf showed us, about the discussion regarding Holocaust survivors, whether they'll tell us to listen to Wagner or not. I was in a symposium, I don't remember, it was in 2001, I think, in Tel Aviv University, and a Holocaust survivor asked publicly the public to refrain from listening to Wagner publicly until we are gone. And I was shocked. And I told her, well, listen, you survived already. You don't expect me to expect your death. So I think the whole idea now is quite twisted. And in any event, it's not the case of Holocaust survivors themselves. It's also, as I tried to say, it's a matter of other generations, and it's not relatives. It's not second generation directly or third generation. I mean, it's a whole notion in Israel, and it doesn't have to do with directly with Holocaust survivors. I mean, it has to do with Holocaust as a memorial site, but not with Holocaust survivors of any generation.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.